Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the International Conference on Women's Rights and Peace 2022. My name is Moon Dayeon. I'll be your moderator today. The International Conference on Women's Rights and Peace 2022 is held under the theme of war, colonialism, and violence against women. And we are holding this conference at the Baekbom Kim-gu Museum from yesterday to today. There will be 6 parts going on for the 2-day conference, and we provide the Korean, English, and Japanese interpretations, language service at the YouTube channel. We provide 3 languages interpretation service on-site with sign language interpretation services. Please use channel 1 for Korean, 2 for English, and 3 for the Japanese language. Now we'd like to begin part 4, post-Cold War and victim stereotypicality. We have now a moderator seated on the stage, Kwon Yang-suk, a professor of Juchi University, who teaches at the Faculty of Global Studies, is the moderator today. And our presenter is Kim Hyung-kyung, professor at College of General Education, Seoul Women's University, and also the discussant, Bae Ha-eun, professor of Daegu Gyeongbuk Institute of Science and Technology. And joining us through video connections, we have Kinoshita Naoko, researcher at the Institute of Social Theory and Dynamics, and discussant Kimura Maki, professor of political science at University College London. I'd like to thank Professor Kimura in particular for joining us at such early hour in the morning, despite the time difference of London and Seoul. Now I'd like to ask the moderator to begin the part. My name is Kwon Yang-suk. I'm your moderator today. I'm professor of Sophia University, teacher at the Faculty of Global Studies. It is an honor for me to be the moderator today. I'd like to thank the organizers for making today's conference possible. We are going to deal with the very important subject of the post-Cold War and victim stereotypicality. And we have 2 discussants and 2 discussants, and we can see the term post being used, and also we use the stereotypicality, which is used within these parentheses. And I think this is being presented without parentheses in the Korean text. And I would like to say that these signs are very important for us. As you know very well, in the 1990s, the Cold War has come to an end between the East and the West. And that is why we use often the term post-Cold War. And I think that in Korea, I sometimes wonder if this Cold War has ended on the Korean Peninsula. After the Cold War has ended, we use the term post-Cold War. So it's used under the parenthesis. I think you can pose it a question on whether the Cold has really ended on the Korean Peninsula by looking at this title of today's session. Many of you may come to agree with my opinion. And also there is an emphasis for the stereotypicality in the parentheses as well. I think there's so much emphasis for us in that as well. People yearn for the healing after having gone through the pain, and they want the perpetrators to be punished. I don't think they want to be recognized as a stereotypical victim. But who are asking the victims to be presenting themselves in the stereotypical manner? We need to think about who the other is, who the others include. It may be that we may be part of the other in posing this question. As such, the post-Cold War and the victim stereotypicality is a theme, and I think we can develop an idea about the general framework of part 4 as we try to begin the discussions for part 4. And I have some housekeeping remarks. We're going to listen to 2 presentations and 2 discussions, and there will be a general discussion to come afterwards. I'd like to ask the audience, particularly those who are seated here at the venue, to actively participate in the Q&A session. Well, they open the floor to receive questions from the floor, but I'd like to ask for your kind understanding in advance that we will be able to receive all the questions given the time constraints. Now, I would like to introduce Professor Kim Hyung-kyung of the College of General Education, Seoul Women's University. She's going to give us a presentation on Cold War and comfort women, 배봉기's forgotten life and contested death. She's going to begin a presentation. And now the microphone is yours.
네, 안녕하세요.
Good morning. Just as been introduced, I'm Kim Hyung-kyung.
저는 어제 또 하루 종일 이 자리에서 좀 참여를 했었는데요. 여러 발표들을 들으면서
the numerous presentations, and it was a very intriguing experience intellectually during that time yesterday. And for all the presenters and audience here and also those online, I believe you all share the same type of emotion and perception. And I hope I could carry on with that momentum and talk about the Cold War and comfort women, 배봉기's forgotten life and contested death as my presentation. In yesterday's presentation, there have been many topics that were suggested, and among them, the silence of women after the violence and its interpretation have been what remained in my mind for the longest. For example, Mr. Domiyama talked about the human and the silence of women after violence. And is it because they cannot speak? Rather, it is an active gesture and struggle in order to survive in their lives. And I remember that interpretation. And Director Park Sunam mentioned that the experience of violence is sometimes difficult to be inoculated. And sometimes there's no other way than to be expressed through language when they are victimized by violence. And in my presentation, I like to talk about the silence of women and human beings after they suffered violence and the power relationship of the reality. And regarding this topic, we remember the keynote speech of Ms. Nastya Krashelikova, who talked about the Ukraine war and the violence against women during the wartime and how this interconnects with the theories and power struggles of the nation as well as other powers. And I believe that my presentation could be in a similar context. And the power struggle in this reality, I would like to call this a post-colonial Cold War regime mechanism. And I like to talk about the case of 배봉기, who became silent due to such violence. When we think of the post-colonial Cold War regime, when you hear this word, I believe it's easy to intuitively understand the meaning of this concept. This refers to an institutional and discursive construct established through colonialism that persisted in East Asia after the dissolution of the Japanese Empire in 1945, entangled with the creation of the Cold War order in the region. And this is about the hot war in the non-Western regime. And this was the basis of the Cold War in that area, in this region, and also the post-Cold War regime after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this has been requested, this has been called for by many East Asian feminist activists, which have been arguing this concept. Then I'll move on to the story of 배봉기. Now in Korea, 배봉기 is a familiar figure, especially in 2014 with the translation of the Red Tile House. She has also been introduced through various films and other productions.
그 배봉기님의 삶을 좀
So if we go through the lifelong movement of Ms. 배봉기, I prepared a map for your easier understanding. She was born in 1914 She was born in Sinewon, Chungcheongnam-do of colonial Joseon in a farmhouse, and she was born as a second daughter. And Baebong-gi was also sent to another family as a future bride and a babysitter. And in 1943, she is offered a job in Hungnam, which is North Korea today. She meets a person who offers a decent work in Hungnam, so she travels through Gyeongsang, the present Seoul, with this person, and then rides a ship in Busan to Shimonoseki, and then goes to Muji. And in the autumn of 1944, she arrives at the Tokashiki Island in Okinawa. 1944, you could assume that that timing was when a good and decent job was being nothing other than a comfort woman. Okinawa, during the World War II, was the only part of Japan's land that saw major ground battles and was under the U.S. military occupation. And she barely survived, and Baebong-gi, under the law of Okinawa, became a stateless person for a long period of time. Even after liberation, she could not return to South Korea or North Korea. In 1972, Okinawa is returned to Japan, and because of the changes in the law, she then falls into the status of an illegal resident. And in 1975, she applies for a special permission to stay, and that is when she comes out and comes forward as a comfort woman, and that she arrived in Okinawa as a comfort woman. And this is the first comfort woman testimony known to date, and it was actually 16 years ahead of Kim Il-sung's testimony, which was going to have made such a testimony in 1991. So for a long period of time, the life and the testimony of Baebong-gi was quite underregarded and neglected in South Korea. In North Korea, in Japan, this was quite different because there was active interest with a series of media reports, documentaries, and publications. So my study starts with the reason for such a difference in interest. Why did Baebong-gi not become the first the witness or person making testimony for a comfort woman? For that, there have been precedent studies on the life of Baebong-gi, and I have based my study on such preceding literature to analyze the lifelong case of Baebong-gi and think of the ongoing effect of colonialism and also the entanglement with colonialism with the East Asian Cold War regime. And up to now, many feminists, when talking about the comfort women issue in the non-visualization, there has been discussion of the Cold War systems. Elaine Kim and Choi Jung-moo, the feminists, have also talked about this in The Dangerous Women and said that South Korea is based on the neo-imperialism, especially led by the U.S. hierarchy, and which became an additional layer. So, the US-led neoliberalism order, the global Cold War order, has been entangled with the Japanese Cold War regime, which made the decolonization of South Korea impossible. And why is it difficult for Japan to decolonize itself? And regarding this, Carol Gluck says during the World War II, Japan and Germany's difference is not because of the cultural issue, because of the international order difference, and because of a different formation of a public memory. Well, so if I elaborate on this part, in the Cold War system in the East Asia, Japan became a border, and it has been conspiring with the forgetting of the Cold War. war, but Germany, which was under the order of the Western regime, admitted its defeat, and that was how it re-emerged in the international society. So Japan, the memory of defeat was created, whereas in Germany, the younger generation has raised the issue of war crime and war responsibility, and this created the public memory in this area. The U.S. hegemony weakens in 1992, and the geopolitical importance of Asia rises, and that is when Japan starts to recognize its responsibility by accepting the international request. And that is when, in 1990, the comfort issue became an international agenda. And based on this discussion, I would like to cite Bertrand's the issue of subaltern mechanism as a basic analysis. The securitization theory, in a short definition, is based on constructionism, and it is interested in how the security theory is socialized during the Cold War regime. And from the context of decolonization, it stresses the securitization in this area. According to Bertrand, the securitization theory itself silences the subaltern because of its core element, and this is connected with the post-colonial feminist theory and the theory of loculation.
예, 그래서 이 버트란드의 이 논의를 제가 나름대로 이제 재구성을 해서
I reconstructed the theory of Bertrand and how the securitization theory worked to make the subaltern silent. So, in this context, first of all, the attempt of the subaltern to speak is being oppressed, and then
그러니까 두 가지 유형이 있는 거죠.
There
두 번째는
is a second
다른 사람이
type,
대신
which is when
대변해서 이
the
서벌턴을 대신해서 말을
subaltern's
하는
speech
데서
is substituted by the speech act of others.
그러면 이 서벌턴 자신의 이 침묵은 다시 한번 말을 아예 할 수 없는
himself or herself
침묵 그리고 말을
first
했지만
a forced
듣는
silence,
사람이 없는
or secondly, a different type of silence when there is no audience, even though they make a loculation caused by the elocutionary frustration. And another silencing mechanism is when the speech or loculation is ununderstood, which results in eloculationary disablement. And so this is based on the logic of exclusion, and then the silence coming from substitution is when different stories are overlapping, which makes it difficult and confusing to understand what the subaltern aims to say. As I follow the lifetime case of 배봉기, I like to look at how she became silent, how her speech became silent, and what other attempts were made, though unintentionally, to substitute the speech of 배봉기 by the act of others. These are the two analyses that I have conducted. My analysis is in 138 to 139 in the Korean brochure. Because of the volume, their Korean version and the English version is different. So in the English version, I do not have my analysis result. I covered the interviews and the media coverage or the film productions or book publications in doing my study on 배봉기. So first of all, when we think of colonialism and war and post-war, I like to look at how they overlapped in affecting the life of Baebongki and how this forced as this function as a mechanism to force silence upon Baebongki. In 1979, this was first emerged, but before that, Baebongki was not even given the opportunity to express her life. This is because, as I said previously, because under the UN trusteeship in the US-ruled Okinawa, Koreans became the so-called non-Ryukwans because they did not have a family register on the Ryukyu Islands under the US Civil Administration Ordinance number 125 that was promulgated in February 1954. And since they did not have a foreign passport, they eventually became stateless. So as such, Baebongki was tangled under the so-called 오생종's citation, that she became entangled under the layers of states that made her stateless. And she starts to take many jobs to make ends meet, for example, in orphanages or hospitals for the US military, or prostitution for US camps. And so she has spent her lifelong time under the effect of the US station. And I also looked at the interviews of Baebongki, and what she repeatedly says is that she didn't have the words to speak. And I think this phrase that says, didn't have the words to speak, I think this implies a superficial meaning of not knowing Japanese well enough, and that was why she couldn't express herself or tell the experience in Japan. And I think there's an underlying meaning of saying that, well, she came to Okinawa and she thought that she would have a decent job, but she went through a very hard and agonizing life experience as working as a comfort woman during the war and even after the war. So in 1975, when Baebongki came forward as a comfort woman, what happened? As I said previously, in the South Korean society, it wasn't that much of an issue. The South Korea society was not interested in this issue. So what was the reason? As I said, the Joseonin in Okinawa in 1950s, they were neither foreigners, they were just stateless peoples. But with the 1965 Treaty on Basic Relations and the agreement concerning legal status and treatment of the Korean people in Korea, there have been changes, but this didn't affect the comfort women in Okinawa. This was affected to other mainland Japanese, Korean in Japan, Japanese in Japan, because a permanent resident status was provided, but the application period was limited to only 5 years, from 1966 to 1971, which was just 1 year before Okinawa's return. So this meant that for the Koreans in Okinawa, they weren't even given the opportunity to apply for the permit. And because of the situation, after the situation, there has been changes with the return of Okinawa to Japan in 1972, and now the Japanese government was obliged to grant Koreans in Okinawa legal status. Though they decided to grant special permission to Korea to stay for Koreans who could present the Japanese national to vouch for them, and also prove that they entered Okinawa before August 15, 1945, and those who did not meet the conditions, they were to be repatriated to South Korea. 3 years later, in October 1975, Baebongki presented herself at the immigration office, declaring that she was a Korean who came to Okinawa as a comfort woman who needed permission to stay. So, as I said, she said that she couldn't speak the language. She wasn't even aware that she had to make an application, and she happened to learn of this fact from the restaurant owner that she was working at. And Baebongki registered herself as a Zainichi, and
그 사실을 스스로 증명하도록 강제한 이제 그러한
under a mechanism where the victims have to prove how the state forcibly relocated them to Japan. And the Baebonggi's appearance immediately drew the attention of the Japanese media, and particularly there was a screening of a documentary, A Grandmother in Okinawa, and this was also reported in the South Korean media. However, the reports that treated the lives of Baebonggi and former comfort women as something just one-off, a trivial news, rather than something that requires in-depth coverage.
그리고 이제 배봉기님이 1977년
in August in 1977, Baebonggi conducted an interview with Joseon Shinbo, and this is shown on the front page of the newspaper, pro-North Korean newspaper. This means that Baebonggi became closer with Cho Chung-yeon when the Mindan and Cho Chung-yeon approached her after Baebonggi made her first testimony as a comfort women. And in an interview, Baebonggi says that in an interview there is a saying that his presence was hardly known in South Korea because she received support from pro-North Cho Chung-yeon activists. And I don't think this is just a groundless assumption. I think this is a grounded fact. And in fact, the South Korean government didn't take much interest in the legal status of Koreans in residence, but they certainly took an interest in the legal status of Koreans in Okinawa at the time of the Okinawa's returns drew near because of the concerns of the expansion of Cho Chung-yeon's influence outside mainland Japan. So considering these circumstances, when Baebonggi emerged, South Korea was only conscious about its Cold War relationship with North Korea to deal with the story and deal with the story of Baebonggi, and this also resulted in why there wasn't the audience to listen to the story of Baebonggi. And next, I'd like to talk about the following contention over the deceased body of Baebonggi, which follows the post-colonial and post-Cold War regime, and how this once again makes Baebonggi silent and erases her population. In October 18, 1991, Baebonggi was found dead, and a funeral was took place one day after. Just as Professor Lee Ae-ryung said yesterday, the testimony of Kim Hak-sun raised a big issue as a major event at that time, and that was because in August of 1991, which is the same year of the death of Baebonggi, Kim Hak-sun makes a testimony of being a comfort woman. This received massive media coverage, and this was what led to the comfort woman movement. And for Baebonggi, whose funeral took place in October 1991, only Hangeul의 newspaper was the only newspaper that covered this news. It was just a very short obituary that was received by the then president of 정대협, Yoon Mi-suk. Instead of having interest in Baebonggi, there was a contention over the deceased body of Baebonggi between the Mindan and Cho Chung-yeon. First of all, from the Cho Chung-yeon side, around the first anniversary of Baebonggi's passing, it cited Baebonggi's statement that she only wanted to return to a unified country without a foreign military presence, and stated that it should be taken as a will, and Cho Chung-yeon proposed to keep her ashes under its proprietorship in Okinawa. On the other hand, Mindan tracked down the relative of Baebonggi, the nephew, which was a son of Baebonggi's sister, and the nephew said that Baebonggi wanted to have her ashes buried in her hometown. And director Park Soo-nam's film The Silence has a very close depiction of this issue. She was actually discovered 5 days after her death, so there's no way of knowing where she really wanted to be buried at the end of her life. But in the book Red Tile Roof House of 1987 and the interviews that were followed on Dr. Park Soo-nam's documentary film, The Song of Arirang Testimony in Okinawa, and the 2016's film Silence, all tells that Bae-bong-gi made statements about her hometown. And of course, she makes contrasting statements. But when we follow her interview, I think it is somewhat contrasting to Chung-yeon's interpretation that she regards her homeland as a divided land deployed with foreign troops. Because Bae seems to have different feelings about her hometown. She says that I dreamt about my hometown, but I couldn't find my home. And in a documentary, she speaks in both Japanese and Korean, and she says that I think I will be lonely when I go back home because I don't have any acquaintances. So how should we interpret her dreams, her statements, her statements of her dreams, saying that I do want to go back, but I think I will be too lonely? And so how should we interpret her statement? So when we think of that, I'm sure you're now familiar with Spivak's work, Can the Subaltern Speak? So I think we could refer to the theory of speaking for the subaltern. And the term representation means recreating another scene and also literally representing something. And so we have to consider how the representation is made. And she analyzes the Indian sati practice and how the British imperialists and the Indian anti-colonial nationalists that attempt to speak on behalf of the sati practice based on their own desires. They ignore the diversity and complexity of the widowed women. And I think the same situation applied to the case of Bae-bong-gi. Min-dan and Cho Chung-yeon both attempted to represent and talk instead of Bae-bong-gi. And I think this is what we can... This erases the diverse meaning of Bae-bong-gi in her death in Okinawa, and it just speaks of only the divided Korean peninsula and the colonialism. What if we care to represent her mixed emotions about returning to her hometown? If so, it might have been possible to devise a way for Okinawa and Bae-bong-gi's hometown to mourn for her death together instead of only deciding to own her ashes to one party or another. Also, I talked about the conflict of Min-dan and Cho Chung-yeon and how it erased the diversity and complexity of Bae-bong-gi's death. But afterwards, the indifference of South Korea makes this even more skeletonized. Back in 1991, the South Korean government had many geopolitical interests intertwined. Well, I think I'm kind of spending too much time, so I don't think I could go into the details, so please refer to the brochure. In 1991, in the case of South Korea, it signs its diplomatic ties with Soviet Union and also pursues ties with China, and there is a reconciliation move between South and North Korea. And North Korea is also discussing diplomatic relations with Japan. So during this time, the comfort women issue does gain much interest and lots of discussion. So, for example, from 1991 to 1993, Japan, South Korea, and North Korea hosted 4 international seminars on peace in Asia and the role of women to discuss the Japanese military comfort women issue. However, in the case of Bae-bong-gi or other comfort women who could not return home, the ideological confrontation still remains, and there have been no movement to respond to that. But the December 16th of 1991 is when the Kim Il-sung issues a lawsuit at the Tokyo District Court, which gains a lot of interest, unlike the indifference toward Baebong-gi. So, this is a table that summarizes my analysis. In the case of Baebong-gi, before her testimony, she was not given the space or opportunity to speak up, and even after the testimony, there wasn't the audience in South Korea. And even after the audience appeared, the indifference toward her stateless situation became another factor that made her silent. And then the substituting speaking of the Mindan and Jo Chang-yeon once again made Baebong-gi silence. This is my conclusion of the study. So this isn't something that ends with the 1990s. When we think of the U.S., Korea, Japanese military alliances talks, I think though the form is slightly different, this post-colonial geopolitical force, a Cold War force, is still very powerful and intact in the East Asian region. We should listen to the diverse and multi-layered story and to represent it, and also to reconstruct and deconstruct the modern order, international order. I think this is the way we should go. Thank you for listening. Professor Kim Young-kyung, thank you very much. You talked about the post-colonial Cold War regime and used this structure and concept in analyzing the case of Baebong-gi, and you have analyzed how the comfort woman becomes invisible. The Baebong-gi's testimony in 1979 has been silent in the East Asian region that was led by South Korea, and you have gave a very thorough analysis of the surrounding circumstances. In 2022, we still have to be aware of the post-colonialism and the Cold War regime, and which is still an ongoing issue. And it made us be aware once again that we are at this point. Next, we'd like to invite
Next, Naoko Kinoshita, the researcher at the Institute for Social Theory and Dynamics, a non-profit organization, will give a presentation titled In Search for a Way of Encountering Survivors Again. Ms. Kinoshita, I'd like to ask you to begin the presentation. Nice to meet you. My name is Kinoshita Naoko. Now, I'd like to show you this slide. And I look forward to today's discussion. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. Yesterday, I have participated in this social campaign, which was waged by one of the presenters, Japanese presenters, yesterday. And I'd like to now begin my presentation. In Japan, in the past few years, not a small number of people in Japanese society have come to perceive comfort women as an issue with distorted facts. It's distorted in the way that in terms of history, there's distortion, and there are also people who question the justification for engaging in such activities. So this is indeed a very difficult situation for people, the activists in Japan. At the end of 2015, the Korean and Japanese governments come to conclude an agreement on the comfort treatment of the comfort women issue. And there's been some strong resistance against this agreement in South Korea. And this triggered a negative response from Japan. The subsequent dissolution of Reconciliation and Healing Foundation took place, and in 2018, the South Korean Supreme Court ruled on the forced labor compensation case. And at the time, Prime Minister Abe was provoking an anti-Korean sentiment among the Japanese people. This has deteriorated significantly, and many of the Diet members have actually fueled the prejudice against South Korea. And then there was a scandal involving the Korean Council for Women drafted for sexual slavery by Japan, which is abbreviated Korean Council. And the Japanese media closely followed new developments on the Korean Council case, and they questioned the legitimacy of the comfort women movement. If you think about the colonial rule, the wartime aggressions, and so on, you will see that there is a strong indifference of people towards the movement in Japan. And it's actually very difficult to change the certain perception, which is quite strong in Japan. And I think it's very important that we need to really review the voices and positions of the victims. And we need a new mind path to re-encounter the survivors. There is a strong image that's been created in Japan that the South Korean government has discarded an agreement that they concluded with Japan. And because this kind of perception is very strong in Japan, the situation is quite serious. Japan and South Korea made a comfort women agreement on the pretext that it reached a final and irrevocable solution. And the Korean government discarded it. And the Japanese government wanted to change the situation in their favor, but the situation actually has made a turnaround because the South Korean government has denied the agreement. So there is the South Korean society and the Japanese society having different positions. And in Japan, people believe that the Japanese government had made a contribution of 1 billion Japanese yen, yet Korea has reneged on the comfort women agreement. And I take an example of a member of the Diet. He argued that the story of 200,000 young women being taken against their will, made into sex slaves, and killed in the end is far from reality, and is aimed at making Japan a criminal state. And the Diet member said that the member will resolutely refute the falsehood that Japan is a murderous and criminal state that kidnapped, imprisoned, and raped minors. And they claim that the stories are false, and the symbolic representation of this falsehood is the Statute of Peace. There is a number of disputes have been created surrounding the Statute of Dispute, and many lawmakers in Japan demanded that the South Korean government remove the statute in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul. When another one was installed in front of the Japanese Consulate General in Busan at the end of 2016, the Japanese government responded very strongly. And there was a member of the Diet that said that when she saw the comfort woman statue erected in the Philippines with a panel describing Japanese military sexual slavery, she was taken aback by such harsh words and shocked to the point of her blood rushing to her head. It's a very strong statement, very radical expression, and I think her position lacks a perspective to imagine the realities that the victims experience. And also there is another comfort women statue erected in San Francisco. And Japan's foreign minister said at the Diet that the sex slave inscription in the statue was an expression going against the historical facts and was not used at all in the Korea-Japan agreement. And there are a lot of talk shows in TV called wide shows in Japan. And those talk shows often featured the statue, and many of the issues on Korea has been featured in these talk shows. When the talk shows feature the statue, the commentators criticize South Korea in their own way. The commentators say that this goes against the sentiments of the Japanese people. It's more like an icon that goes against the sentiments of the Japanese people. And the statue erected in front of the Japanese embassy or in other public places are regarded to be acting out of anti-Japanese sentiments. And it was a grave situation for the Japanese people who hated the statues, and this fueled prejudice and distrust towards South Korea to accelerate the racism. And when the statues are presented in public spaces, people overreacted often. And one example is the Aichi Triennale 2019 Art Festival. The exhibition had displayed a statue under the title of Hyogen no Fuji Yuten, non-freedom of expression. And the show had been, the exhibition had to be cancelled because of this complaint. And the exhibition resumed just before the closing of the art festival, but there was strict security and entry restrictions. So the girl statue is being regarded with some resentment, and the general public came to see this exhibition against this backdrop. And I think the exhibition has actually provided a turning point for the people to find issues with the current way that the TV shows featured the comfort women issue. And the God statue reflects the official opinion of the Chung Dae-hyuk. And the forcibly taken, the 강제연애 expression, is a term that symbolizes the suffering of the Korean women, the comfort women issue. And this is also another imagery that we develop with the comfort women issue. The term forcibly taken is also a keyword for the Japanese right-wing faction who want to deny it. In Japan, a cabinet decision was issued in 2007 that no evidence could be found of comfort women being forcibly taken against their will. And this is the result of the government investigation from 1991 to 1993. The investigation report stated that no record that supports women being forcibly taken by the military or the government was found. And the Japanese media is actively engaged in indicating the falsehood of the comfort women issue by emphasizing the Japanese government's position, not recognizing comfort women being forcibly taken as a historical fact. And some lawmakers relentlessly insist that the comfort women issue is a fabrication based on the reports of Asahi Shimbun. And this is, according to them, a false statement by a person named Yoshita Seiji that women were forcibly taken. And this was followed by a false reporting of the Asahi Shimbun that built on it. And this is a fragmented understanding. And this has led to Japanese bashing on the Asahi Shimbun. And the lawmakers are also deploying a coercive method of overseas slamming the Asahi Shimbun in the diet without considering other factors. However, I would like to say that there are also opposition lawmakers who question and criticize right-wing lawmakers' historical perspectives on the comfort women system. There are steady efforts to clarify the perception of the Japanese government by continuing to issue inquiry statements based on Japan's aggression as a premise. And there are also issues pertaining to what should be our perspective towards the survivors. I'd like to present you with some of my ideas. In May of 2020, Lee Yong-soo, one of the comfort women victim survivor, gave an interview. She actually gave 2 interviews, and she raised an issue, steered a big issue within the South Korean society. And Japan's the TV shows also featured this news, and she raised an issue about the Chung Dae-hyuk on how the funds have been used. And there's been some the criticism of Chung Dae-hyuk and Yoon Mi-hyang. And TV shows in Japan feature this news every day, reporting suspicions about the money issues. And activists who previously worked in the Korean Council argued in defense of the organization and Yoon. And in Japan, Yamashita Young said that those of us in Japan, also need to respond to these questions and will be required to reflect on the past movement as they do in South Korea. And majored the organizations have their guidelines in Korea, and just by following the policy lines along the Korean organizations, we may not be able to keep the voices of various survivors. We need to think about solidarity. It's not something just about rushing together in a factional struggle. It's about thinking autonomously and having imagination, not to lose possibility of connecting with survivors under various circumstances. And the victims we need to open up the possibilities of listening to their voices. And also, there is a Japanese comfort woman victim who used the pseudonym Suzuko Shirota, and she published essay. And we believe that if we do not recognize these voices of the victims, we may be not fully respecting their respect. Surita Shizuko has spent her remaining life in a women's shelter, and she wrote letters to the managers of the shelter, and she wrote essays. She even said that she is going to be 60 years old in 1980. She wrote to the manager of Katsu, and she said that I declared that I will be 60 years old. And she said that I want to be healthy. I want to be able to walk around on crutches, ride a bus or train, and even visit Tokyo. And she said that she wanted to end the post-war life. And after the war, she has continued to work in the sex industry, and until she was admitted to the women's shelter, and she became quite ill, and she was disabled. And she was to put an end to that kind of life, the post-war life, and start over in 1980. And Shirota also wrote another letter, said that she's a Christian, and that she is a former sex industry worker, and she wanted to bear witness to God's love. And she felt that it is her way of repaying for God's grace, just as it is. Through her religious life, and by displaying her faith, she wanted to obtain approval from the staff at the women's shelter. And she wanted to develop a positive self. So this is part of a survival strategy. And Ms. Shirota lived on the social protection. But as a fallen woman, being regarded in fallen woman, which was quite obvious in the Japanese society, she felt that she needed to realize self-affirmation. And I think it's essential that we read her text from a feminist point of view. She felt that she was very happy to have found a place, a safe living environment in a facility. And she also lamented the situation of not having a family. She said that her family could not protect her, and she found a meaning in her life in the facility. And this is a community that replaced her family. And she was angered by what she had gone through when she was a teenager. And she met for media for interviews quite often, but she left a lot of writings in her memoir. And there are the Japanese, the comfort women victims who did not make the appearance. And the media is silencing them, so she resisted against those that kind of practices. And also the women's the status was not fully recognized in the Japanese society, and I think effort should be made to recognize the women's these experiences. The harsh reality that the victims faced, we need to cultivate the imagination against those harshness experienced by the victims. And we need to look at the social structure that continues today, that continues to suppress women. And in Japan, the victims who protest sexual violence continue to suffer from secondary victimization. There's no legislation to support women who want to use their maiden name after marriage. And half of the women are irregular workers, single women are deprived of access to assisted reproductive medical care, and foreign industrial trainees are restricted from having babies and giving birth. In other words, Japanese society have, with little regard for the right to sexual self-determination and reproduction, in which women find great difficulties in designing their lives as an independent human beings. And the Japanese comfort women victims have been excluded from the post-war compensation because Japanese society lacks the perspectives of ensuring human rights and holding the state responsible for its violence. As such, the contemporary Japanese are unable to enjoy their rightful right as human beings. The issue of the comfort woman emerged in the 1990s. It first became known as the issue of Korean victims of the Japanese military sexual slavery. No major support movement was organized for Japanese comfort women victims. As such, the Japanese victims never criticized the direction of the Japanese movement. It doesn't mean that the movement does not have to examine the Japanese survivors' words. The Japanese activists and researchers need to make effort for the active listening and self-reflection. And it may be desirable to help the Japanese victims' anguish and the overseas victims. Please reach out to the Japanese society. Shirota said that I've seen women's help back there. And this statement should be known to the public as the actual sentiment of the person concerned. Racism is rampant in Japanese society, where reflection on the colonial rule and domination of neighboring countries is often absent. In Japan, generally speaking, they lack seriousness in listening to the voices of South Korea and other comfort women victims in the thought of their supporters. A structured understanding is called for to find out how discrimination based on race and nationality has exacerbated the harsh conditions of the comfort women. In Japanese society, if they faced up seriously to the issue of comfort women, the criticism of the ongoing wartime sexual violence would have been more active. And after the Estonians, women staged a protest outside the Russian embassy in Estonia in April, and women in Lithuania and Latvia also protested outside their countries' Russian embassies. These women wore black plastic bags on their heads, and they tied their black hands behind their backs and exposed their underwear and legs to express their bleeding lower bodies. And this is to show how harsh the situation was for the victims. And people with this kind of sensitivity choose to actively bear the burden of staging protests on behalf of the victims who are unable to move in the midst of violence. And it shows how inhumane and pathetic the ploy of the Japanese right-wing makers are, who try to raise the traces of the comfort women system's violence. When it comes to the physical presence, the control is to be resisted in our everyday life. After Russia's military invasion of Ukraine began, the Japanese government also provided humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine. However, regarding the reality that the misery brought about by the war, especially for women through violation of their bodies, very few Japanese media have taken an introspective look and examined how Japan has faced pastime, wartime sexual violence to verify state violence conducted in the past. Rather, I think there's only a few. There are various forms of the violence, and they are still found in Japanese systems. And we believe that we need to further enrich the solidarity of the people's experience. We need to overcome different genders and ages, and we need to enrich the solidarity experience of those coming from varying generations, genders, and a difference in support of the comfort women issue. This brings to me the end of my discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Kinoshita. She talked about the situation after the Korea-Japan agreement was made. You said that the comfort after after the comfort women agreement, especially in media, the words of comfort women victims are hardly being transmitted. In particular, you talked about the Japanese comfort woman victim known as Shirota Suzuko. You said that it is up to the reader to judge and discuss what kind of society Japan should be by hearing her voice with empathy. And also, at the same time, you pointed out that all of us should cultivate the imagination on the harshness experienced by the victims in consideration of the source of the pain, as a number of pains that continue to this day. As such, you suggested that we pursue the comfort women issue from the realities of everyday life.
And now, after the two presentations, we'll move on to the discussion. First, I'd like to invite Professor Bae Hae-eun of the School of Undergraduate Studies of the College of Transdisciplinary Studies of Daegu Gyeongbuk Institute of Science and Technology. She will make a presentation on the stateless Japanese military comfort women victims, where they stand, and they're speaking on Professor Kim Young-kyung's presentation. Thank you for the introduction. I am Bae Ha-eun, as been introduced. I would like to discuss the presentation of Professor Kim Young-kyung, and as I read through the paper, I also thought about the topic of state in the survivors. As I listened to Professor Kinoshita's presentation as well, when following the detailed historical proceedings following the Comfort Women Agreement between Korea and Japan. As I started to have an academic interest in the comfort women issue, I started thinking about why this has to be represented by the nation state. How has the issue of the Japanese military comfort women issue be reconstructed from the national level? And as I read through Professor Kim Young-kyung's paper, it gave me certain answers, and at the same time, it also raised some new questions about the role of the nation state. So I'd like to ask a couple of questions regarding that. I do not have a PowerPoint material. I have a brief discussion paper, so I like to read through my discussion paper that's in the given out material. The Cold War and Comfort Women Bae Bong-gi's Forgotten Life and Contested Death of Professor Kim Young-kyung presents a post-colonial Cold War regime, a combined outcome of the colonialism dismantle after the end of World War II, and the post-colonial Cold War system that's recognized by the U.S. at its center. And according to the author, South Korea is an essential sub-partner in maintaining the Cold War regime in East Asia, has neglected the presence and location of the Japanese military comfort women who remained in Okinawa in consideration of its confrontation with North Korea in a triangular partnership with Japan and the U.S. At the same time, amid the political changes in East Asia in the post-Cold War era in the 1990s, South Korea erased the oppression of colonialism and the Cold War regime, reflected upon these women's deaths, dismissing them as a mere shadow of a bygone era. And this is not only for Bae Bong-gi, but this also reminds us of the fact that the testimony of these comfort women, including Bae Bong-gi, have reached us after undergoing complex interactions between the silence imposed by the dynamics and state hierarchies under the international political system and the locations that break such silence. And the Cold War suppressed Bae and other comfort women victims who remained in Okinawa from engaging in locutionary acts. It also makes us be aware that there was no audience to listen to and understand their testimonies. So, raising its voice itself was not enough condition for them to be heard. The comfort women issue is a complex one involving colonialism and war, the structures of domination in interstate relations, and military sexual violence stemming from them. The testimonies on it can be fully executed as a locutionary act composed of speaking, listening, understanding, and responding only when they have a nation-state as a stage and the audience who is also the agent. A case in point is the remarks of Kim Ak-sun, a South Korean national, who first testified publicly about the sufferings of the comfort women in 1991. And her statement led to the South Korea's enactment of the Act on the Livelihood, Stability, and Commemorative Projects, as well as for the sexual slavery victims drafted for the Japanese Imperial Army in 1993. Neither the two Koreas nor Japan could call upon Bae at a time when the dissolution of colonialism and the formation of the Cold War regime overlapped, as the boundaries of the nations and their people changed in a complicated way. In a way, the comfort women who remained in Okinawa were placed at a completely different level from the Korean and Chinese comfort women because they were deprived of a space to testify along with their nationality. In this regard, the best case of the stateless comfort women sympathetically shows that the state is an essential variable for the speech of the victims of sexual violence caused by colonialism, imperialism, and interstate wars. However, her case also recalls a familiar question that has been discussed repeatedly. That is, under the modern nation-state system, one needs to necessarily belong to a state in order to discuss damages related to sexual violence that involves the state's hierarchical relationship between the dominant and the dominated. How can we solve this problem? At the same time, Professor Kim Young-kyung's paper argues that Bae could not complete her locutionary act because the South Korean audience was unwilling to accept her words. Then, could such an act be carried out only when it is heard and understood by the state? I believe we could ask this type of question. And was Bae's location actually directed toward South Korea? I also read the red-tiled roof house, and I thought that was this a statement made toward the South Korean audience? And was it only effective only when it is heard by the South Korean audience? So this is a question I'd like to ask to Professor Kim. Bae's recollections and testimonies about her life in post-war Okinawa, which was recorded by Fumiko Kawada, give the impression that her speech escapes the stage, which is a state, and the space composed of audience come agents. Her painful but solid testimony about her poverty in colonial Joseon and sexual violence and exploitation in the front lines of the empire and the hardships of war and the insecure post-war life of an illegal resident is a self-representation of a stateless victim of the Japanese military comfort woman accomplished by itself. On the other hand, no relevant state such as Japan, US, colonized Joseon, or South Korea can be established as a party that can recognize and understand her testimony. Instead, Fumiko Kawada's representation of her testimony is clearly oriented toward the states in the post-colonial Cold War, where domination and oppression continue in the form of imperialism, colonialism, and the Cold War. So not only the testimony, but also the representation of those that recorded it plays an important role in this context. It seems natural that South Korea had to be the primary audience for her testimony, except for Japan, where Bae's story was first shown. Of course, we could consider North Korea, but basically, the hometown that Bae Bong-gi wanted to return to was in South Korea. Nonetheless, would it not be possible to find an exceptional aspect in her locutionary act, such as excluding the presence of the state as an audience? And this is the question that continued to remain within me. The reason for asking this question is that Bae stands on a borderline that transcends nation states, although she may not have intended to do so. And Im Kyung-hwa's study, which is a preceding paper mentioned in Kim Young-kyung's work, raises the question: how was it possible for the Korean comfort women victims to testify in Japan, a perpetrator of the colonial rule and war of aggression, publicly in such early days? Because during 1970s, Korea was under the martial law, and in Japan, it was still under the Cold War regime during this time. So this is a quite justifiable question that could be asked. And could one of the factors be that Bae was a stateless person who belonged to neither the South nor the North? Because of her status, her testimony did not have legal force to hold Japan accountable for being the perpetrator. At the same time, she was not a Chinese Korean, so her words did not directly target Japanese society to incur shame or social anxiety. Around the same time, South Korea suppressed testimonies through patriarchalism, nationalism, and colonial masculinities, defeatism. Having become stateless overnight under the post-colonial Cold War regime, Bae was standing as a liminal factor on the borderline at a level far away from the silence imposed by such forces. Again, what does nationality mean to the comfort women and victims? And related to Professor Kim Young-kyung's presentation and paper, I started to ask this question. Are the state and the victim's nationality inevitably involved because it is a crime of sexual violence caused by the structure of dominance and war among states? If that is so, testimonies of stateless people like Bae are bound to fail because Bae's locutionary act was fully completed in the South Korean society in the 2010s because she could be classified as a Zainichi Korean in a broad sense due to Okinawa's return to Japan. However, would it really be the case? Is there any performativity that enables speaking a location that can be carried out only by a stateless, liminal, comfort woman victims like Bae? If there is one, what would that be? Rediscovering and reconstructing these issues will be another research task on the testimonies of comfort women victims such as Bae Bong-gi. And thank you for listening to my discussion. Thank you very much. You talked about the nation-state regime and how the dominating and the dominated hierarchical relations of a nation-state intervenes with the victims of sexual violence. And you raised the question, does the victim necessarily need to be a nationality of a certain state? And is the locutionary act only effective only when it is heard and understood by a nation? So what about the stateless people like Bae Bong-gi and those who are on the borderline? And you talked about a very important topic related to the speaking and its possibility of being heard.
Now for the second discussion, I'd like to introduce Professor Maki Kimura, Professor of Political Science at University College London. She will give a presentation entitled Uncovering Voices of Victim Survivors, Building Political Solidarity Around the Victims, Survivors, Japan's Military Sexual Slavery.
The introduction, and first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this conference, and the staff at the Japanese Military Comfort Women Issue Research Institute and everyone who made this conference possible. I'm really sorry that I'm not participating in person as this is the middle of the academic term. It was not possible for me to travel to join the conference. But I'm extremely grateful to have this opportunity to join and connect with colleagues attending the conference. And I'm also thankful to Dr. Kinoshita for the paper that raises many critical issues concerning the current politics surrounding Japan's military sexual slavery. Dr. Kinoshita's paper entitled In Search of a New Way to Encounter Survivors highlights the troubled history of politics on the issue of Japan's sexual slavery and explore the reasons of this stagnated politics and suggest that how attending to the voices of those forgotten in the discussion of Japan's military sexual slavery could provide us the possibility to move beyond this contemporary deadlock politics on this issue. And we all know that since Kim Hak-sun shared her experience, her testimony encouraged many other women to come forward. Some feminists see this as a critical momentum that eventually accumulated to the Me Too movement of the early 21st century, as we know. However, a considerable number of right-wing politicians, scholars, and other cultural critics in Japan have repeatedly denied the central role that the Japanese government played in developing and operating this horrific system of Japan's system of sexual slavery. As Dr. Kinoshita points out in her paper, this backlash against survivors and other activists who tirelessly continued to fight for the recognition of victim survivors' injuries, further escalated after the announcement of the 2015 Japan-Korea Agreement. A Girl of Peace statue, which was originally erected in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul in 2011, which was originally erected in, to commemorate the 1000th anniversary of the Wednesday protest, as well as memorials built elsewhere in South Korea and in other countries, were unfortunately used to trigger and further strengthen the attack by these Japanese right-wing people. Dr. Kinoshita argued that with all this political tension over Japan's Me Too sexual slavery that has lasted 30 years, the victim survivors' voices, in particular, certain groups of victim survivors have often been left behind. She maintains that listening to voices, in particular of those who have been ignored, and understanding the complex experience of suffering could provide an avenue to move beyond this political stagnation concerning Japan's Me Too sexual slavery. And an example, using an example of Shirota Suzuko's life to demonstrate how this could be possible. So Shirota Suzuko, while her name is pseudonym, is one of the only few Japanese women who testified to her experience of sexual slavery. Her life, as we heard in her Dr. Kinoshita's presentation, has become well known through her biographies and interview that she made. Her the pain of Shirota and many other Japanese women who were considered to have become so-called prostitutes should not be belittled in the name of what we call the noble sacrifice that Japanese people were expected to make in the support of national war. And this is the often used rhetoric by Japanese revisionists. So their claim has not only silenced Shirota's voice, but also that of women from various countries in Asia who came forward to reveal their experience. At the same time, her pain should not be denied on the basis of the fact that she was indeed sold into prostitution, together with agony of many other women from Japan and Japanese colonies and occupied territories who encountered a similar fate to her. In the early stage of the redress movement, women who had a history of being comfort women were divided into two distinctive categories of those who were forced and those who were voluntary. Women like Shirota were seen as falling into the latter category, and her scarred life experience was either ignored or unacknowledged, ignored or unproblematized. However, the notion of involuntary or forced has since been understood to include much wider range of experience, claiming that it's not how women became comfort women in the first place, but how they were subjected to slave-like conditions during the time that they were treated as a comfort women that actually matters. In this sense, Shirota was a slave, sex slave, as well as other women, say from Korea, the Philippines, China, the Netherlands, and beyond, who claimed that they were sex slaves and who rejected being called comfort women. Shirota's suffering after the war, which has been revealed through her narratives, as Dr. Kinoshita shared with us, attest to the traumatic sexual slavery. Not only her life after the war, difficult financially, not only was her life after the war difficult financially and physically, but she was also mentally traumatized by the echo of the cries of women who were killed at the battlefield and did not live to see the end of the war. To those women who did not survive, thus whose suffering and lives remain acknowledged and forgotten, Schroeter wished to erect a memorial, which materialized in 1986. So this memorial is one of the first memorial to victims of Japan's military sexual slavery. Engaging with her excruciating experience requires compassion, combined with an acute awareness of the political and social structure within which Schroeter and other women's lives can be situated. This involves developing and deepening the understanding of the complex history and system of nationalism, imperialism, colonialism, militarism, capitalism, and patriarchy, as well as Western-centered understanding of modernity that created a structure of exploitation based on ability, class, gender, sexuality, and race, ethnicity. However, the lack of this knowledge, especially in Japan, has prevented the redress movement from fully attending to voices like Schroeter for a long time, and from effectively revealing to the world through her life experience this systematic structure of oppression. A historical absence of the discussion of such structure of exploitation and violence has, Dr. Kinoshita points out, sustained a society in Japan where sexism, racism, and xenophobia prevails. Dr. Kinoshita's paper reminds us that we who live in the 21st century should understand that feeling sympathy for Schroeter's misfortune and hardship does not represent a true encounter with her life experience and her voice. We should rather evoke anger that she had to suffer due to this complex system of exploitation and oppression and trying to challenge it. At the same time, we must acquire a critical gaze to acknowledge how this system continues to maintain a society today where gender equality continues. Addressing the issue of Japan's military sexual slavery should not confine this legacy of victimization to a narrow national and ideological context. Exploring and listening to voices of those women should open up the possibility of understanding cries of victims and survivors of various other forms of oppression. This requires raising awareness of how they are all connected at the roots and involves nurturing compassion with each other while forming political solidarity to tackle such a system of oppression. In her recorded interview in November 2021, to celebrate the broadcasting of a documentary titled Unreported World, Justice for Japan's Wartime Sex Slaves, produced by Channel 4, a British public service television network. Grandma Lee Yonsu, who gave her honorable speech through video yesterday, speaks of the continuing impact of this injustice, while also drawing attention to how it can contribute to the reshaping and present and future. In the panel discussion that was also organized at the same time with the screening of the documentary and the recording of the interview with Grandma Lee, discussants, I was one of them, were all agreed that examining and engaging with the issue of Japan's military sexual slavery is to address a broader structure of exploitation, injustice, and violence of the past and present, and involves linking a seemingly disconnected experience of oppression with each other. While importance of acknowledging the specific victimization suffered by women who fell victims of the system of Japan's military sexual slavery is undeniable, meaning that avoiding the pain being reduced to a generalizable experience. we are also presented with a task to consider, as Grammar Lee demands, what lesson that we can learn from their experience and how the social structure can be challenged to prevent the recurrence of such injustice. However, the limited recognition by those who are involved in the debate surrounding this issue of the potential that the voices of survivors hold as the redress movement, which has been well represented most recently surrounding the politics of memorials. The first memorial to victim survivors of Japan's mutual sexual slavery on public land was erected in Paradise Park, New Jersey, near New York, in 2010. The installation of the statue of a girl of peace in Seoul in December 2011 has since triggered a range of initiatives, not only in South Korea, but also in other countries. While the statue of the girl of peace takes the form of a girl wearing a traditional Korean dress representing the loss of a girlhood, the empty chairs beside the girl, young girl, symbolizes the spirit of those women who did not survive and those who survived and participated in the demonstration, sitting side by side on the portable chairs facing the Japanese embassy, and also all the others who participated in the protest to raise awareness of sexual violence. The statue was named the Statue of a Girl of Peace and never designated as a memorial solely dedicated to victim survivors of Japan's mutual sexual slavery. Not understanding this context has, however, generated many disputes over constructing memorials, leading to the politics of memorialization. The relative success of campaigns for erecting memorials for victim survivors across the globe can partly be explained by the development of transnational feminist network. But at the same time, the accomplishment of campaigns and the continued presence of memorials, in particular in countries beyond Asia, relies heavily on the capacity to address both distinctive local narratives of trauma and war and global ones, trying to achieve justice for those who have long been marginalized and silenced, uncovering voices for those women who have been sidelined in the discussion of Japan's mutual sexual slavery, such as Schroeter, reflecting on causes such marginalization, with, as suggested by Dr. Kinoshita, as well as by the presentation of Professor Kim Hyung-kyung on by Bonki, allow us to cast a critical gaze towards unjust social structure of the past and present. This also enables us to build a strong solidarity to move towards a more socially just society where the suffering and injustice of the past is properly acknowledged and remembered. So that the problem is, however, that we know what we need to do, but we are yet to discover how to achieve this. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much. Well, there's been a lot of the legacy of numerous victims that should not be discussed in national context, state context only. They should rather be linked to raising awareness of how the various victims are connected in their roots. She made important points such as forming political solidarity to fight against the system of oppression, at the same time fostering compassion and empathy for each other. She also commented on the lessons we can learn from experiences of the victims and how we can change the social structure to prevent recurrences. Thank you, Professor Kimura. And now we'd like to invite the presenters to respond to the discussions. I would first ask Professor Kim Hyung-kyung to respond to Peha's discussion.
Professor Bae provided a very rich and also a very accurate and sharp observation. And thank you also for a very sharp and meaningful question. Well, this might be a slightly personal digression. This paper is kind of a reflection on my part. I asked this question toward myself as if I were paying retrospect to my personal life. Why was Bae not able to be the first testimonial person in South Korea? In a sense, it also follows a kind of, it's not kind of a competition. I don't want to think of it as a competition between Bae or Kim Ak-sun, saying who should have come first or not. It is rather a reflection of why were we so ignorant about the existence of Bae for such a long time. That was the first question that I asked myself. And with a feminist identity, I started to engage in this study from 1990s, and back then there were numerous topics and issues. Nevertheless, the testimony and Bae and the Japanese comfort woman movement, even if it should have been a major feminist issue of South Korea, it did not gain enough attention. And the Japanese comfort woman movement, and also the Bae, of course, it did not become the triggering point for me to start my feminist study. It still, nevertheless, was a very impactful event that led my study in the feminist area. From 2010 and on, I became aware of the Bae testimony, and just as Professor Bae mentioned, I listened to Bae statement and also the documentaries and recordings of Bae. And this was how I became aware of that existence. This isn't just a reflection on myself only. I think it is also a reflection on the part of South Korea as a whole. And from a different angle, we could also say that if there is a speaker, there should be a listener for the speaking act to be perfected and complete. And considering this interrelation, the speaking of Bae, in order for that to be complete, it requires the audience that will listen to that. It requires that element. And just as you mentioned, the possibility of speaking of Bae is ensured only by the audience, the existence of audience. And then we have to think of whether it should be limited to the community of South Korea or a certain state alone, or it should be a bigger community. This study focuses not so much on the speaker as the audience, that is the listener. And I think this is an issue that we should continue to think about by going beyond the nation state and thinking about the listener group or the audience group. Well, we experience that in many occasions, just like today. We experience such cases and then we go back to our normal lives and we try to enlarge such community. But at the same time, as a nationality of a nation state, we have that individual identity. That experience alone does not necessarily enable us to think that we have overcome that limitation. So the tension of, I think we should still, that is why I think we should still be aware of the tension of the identity of having a nationality when we are a listener. And this applies to not only the testimonies of Bae, but also to the testimonies of the survivors, because they speak of something more than just what we listen to, than just what we hear. It speaks of something broader. This exceeding possibility is something that we should understand and interpret. And are we doing enough? Especially in the South Korean society, the victims' testimony has been discussed by many feminists, implies that it is still regarded only as a technological supplement to recording, and it still doesn't have enough ground to be regarded as a full topic of in-depth study. That is another retrospect I like to raise, because these series of events could also have controversy. So there are cases where we should accept testimony or reject a certain testimony. Just as Ms. Lee Kyung-hee mentioned yesterday, we should think of victims not only in their stereotyped form, but also the diversified or the diverse victims. That is, we have to think of the diverse directions of reading these testimonies. And that is a necessity that we should acknowledge. Then we should think of the audience that goes beyond the nation-state community. Of course, this part is something that we should gain attention to, and it was also discussed by Yamatani Techuo of the Grammars of Okinawa of 1995, and also Director Park Sung-nam's series. These works have already captured on the possibility in an earlier time by enabling this form of listening. I think it was quite early in its effort, a pioneering effort that goes beyond this limited community, and that was why it resulted in meaningful achievement. So once again, just as Ms. Mae mentioned, considering the talking and the speaking and the testimony of the victims, we should have a delicate observation, a delicate understanding, and I do agree with that. So for that, as I listened to the case in Japan, the Japanese victim victim survivors' testimony is something that seems very contemporary. And I think it would be meaningful to think of not only Bae-bong-gi or Kim Hak-sun or Shiruta, but others who were in the contemporary period, and to go over their testimonies from this perspective. In South Korea, before Kim Hak-sun, in addition to Bae-bong-gi, there were Do Soo-bok or the Grandma Hun who have existed. I think that it would also be, I am already engaged in the studies of these survivors, so I will consider the possibility of the speaking that could go beyond the audience, and this made me realize that we should have a more keen eye for listening as an audience. With that, I'd like to conclude my reply. Thank you very much.
So, Ms. Kinoshita, Dr. Kinoshita, would you like to respond to Professor Maki's comments? Yes, I am Kinoshita. I would like to thank you for the very kind comments. And for your detailed discussions, I'd like to extend my heartfelt appreciations, and I am not able to deliver to the fullest what I intend to say in my paper, but you were very kind to elaborate further on what I had missed out. I very much appreciate your comments. I listened attentively to what you said. With regards to Shirota Suzuko, I was not able to make a detailed comment about her life, her experiences, and so on. And because you gave us an explanation, I think your discussions would have helped the audience a great deal in developing a deeper understanding about Ms. Shirota. Ms. Shirota has experienced war, and she faced the threats of death many times in her life, and it was very nice of you to have commented on that part as well. Essentially speaking, if you think about the comfort women, Japanese comfort women, I think it's the same as the comfort women of other countries. They have gone through the sex slave experience. In that experience is the same. In the 1990s, the comfort women movement began, and research efforts also began, but we were not able to explore this matter to the fullest since then. Because in the early 1990s, when the research efforts became more active and the campaigns became more active, the Japanese comfort women have been regarded to have come from a prostitution industry, the sex industry. So I presented this as a keyword in my presentation, but they have been largely regarded as people who are different from Korean women who have been forcibly taken. So that's the kind of perception that prevailed at the time, and because of that, it was very difficult to do a research on the Japanese comfort women victims. And in Korea, researchers actively engage in this research efforts, and also the activists were very active in the campaigns, and we tried to form solidarity with them. And we were mindful of this solidarity activities, and in a way we kind of refrained from actively engaging in the research efforts and so on. And the situation was has persisted to quite recent days. In Korea, there's been a lot of exhibitions and a lot of activities going on with regards to the comfort women movement. And I think a change is going on these days. And I think we are developing a new foundation to bring about new changes in the way that we respond to these issues. And that's the point I want to make about Shirota Suzuko's case. And on the kind of the nature of the system that the comfort woman was, and the kind of oppression the slavery system had on women, I think that your discussions provide a new venue for us to think about it. On the documentary that's been produced by a British TV channel, you are a part of this panel discussion. And you gave us an introduction. I really wanted to hear more, hear about that, the documentary and the panel experience. So thank you for that. And recently, we are looking at wartime, the sexual violence. We are still facing difficult challenges to this date. And in many parts of the world, discussions are going on in various forms. And I was able to understand that through your comments. And on the Japanese comfort women, I said that many worked previously in the sex industry, but I think there are a few exceptions as well. There have been cases where the Japanese women were forcibly taken as well. But as I said earlier, there is like a framing for Korean women who have been forcibly taken to work as a sex slave. And I talked about the girl statue. So when you think of this image of a young woman that has been forcibly taken to perform things against her will. And I think I wanted to express my interest in the research of this topic, but I did not have enough time. So I'd like to supplement on that and have another opportunity to engage in research efforts on that regard. The installation of the girl statue, you mentioned it, the campaign to install these monuments. You talked about injustice and war. A review for perspectives on the injustice and war. It should be when these discussions are going on well, then the installation of the monuments are more easier compared to other countries where discussions are not so active. I think that was that meant a lot to me. And if those activities can be actively discussed and it can be remembered in a given place, that will be quite positive. And also, we need to strongly drive the movement to go forward. And we tend to come up with a set of images to be able to do that. To which extent should we take these images as a tool for our campaign? I think it may be meaningful that we review on the images that we apply or the images that we deploy. How did the movement, how was the movement activated vis-à-vis those images? I think we need to review that as well. And also, I think this relates to the past experiences of it connects to the experiences of these victim women survivors and how it alienates the experiences of the victim survivors. And I want to further deepen knowledge on those aspects in the future. And I had a great deal to learn from your comments, Professor Kimura. And also, I learned a great deal from the presentation by Professor Kim Hyung-kyung and discussion by Professor Bae Ha-eun. It was a great learning experience for me. And before she passed away, she made her testimonies. And she made testimonies for many years. And here I'm referring to Bae Bong-gi, the late Bae Bong-gi. I was greatly inspired by her life. With that, I'd like to conclude my discussion. Thank you very much. Well, we're only about 15 minutes away before concluding today's discussion.
So I'd like to know if there are any questions from the audience, from the floor. And you should also tell us who you're asking the question to.
네, 안녕하세요.
Hello, I am Yang Mi-gang.
오랫동안 위안부 문제
And I've been long interested in the comfort women issue, and I have been long active for a long period of time. I'd like to ask a question to either Professor Kim Hyung-kyung or somebody else. I'm not sure. As I listened to the presentation, new thoughts came to my mind. And when you think of the comfort woman Bae Bong-gi, why did we have a greater interest in Kim Il-sung's testimony in South Korea? And I started to think about that. When we go back to the 1990s, when the Japanese military comfort woman issue gained major interest in South Korea, as you talked about the speaker and the listener, and I do understand that the speaker, that is the listener, has an important role to play. But I think the when and where is also very important for the listener, because the 1990s and the 2020s of today would have a different setting. And the form of listening of 1990s in that past was when the comfort woman issue first emerged. And the foremost movement was mainly focused on asking the apology and the reparation on the nation-state level. Of course, today, the nationalism is an issue that we have to think about from diverse perspectives. So this is a structural underlying factor that we could not overlook. For the Shirota Suzuko's issue, who is a Japanese comfort woman, so from a relative perspective, in South Korea back then, it was not easy to raise an issue about the Japanese comfort woman. So considering these differences, I think we have to think of when and where and how the listener changes. And with this change of listener, how does the society react differently? I think these are the detailed and phase-based process we should take. And secondly, we listened to the presentations of Bae Bong-gi, Kim Il-sung, and also Grandma Hu. So I think the discourse has been focused on the Korean victims. So when we follow this logic, what about the North Korean victims? And in the Asian Youth Forum, we have members from the Philippines. What about the first witness, Ms. Rosa of Philippines? Are we listening to her appropriately? What about the Indonesian victim? So from this comprehensive perspective, our method of storytelling still may not be overcoming the nationalism structure. We have victims in all parts of Asia. And how are we listening to the voices of the other victims in Asia? We have to think of this issue. So, well, Professor Kim Young-kyung, could you answer? I don't know who could answer, but this is a question I'd like to raise. Thank you. So, since we don't have enough time, we will receive some more questions and then ask for the answers. And then, after we listen to both the questions, we'll ask for the answer.
My name is Linda Mo. Yesterday and today, through the lectures, I've been listening to today's presentations and yesterday's presentations. This question came to my mind. The Japanese military sex slavery is a state violence against women, individuals. And I kind of got this feeling that there's been little research on the state violence. Because if you think about those the comfort women victims, we often study about their lives, their experiences, but we study very little about what the state should do. We all talk about the women, the victims in Ukraine. And Japan has incurred the pain to women at the end of World War II. And we look at the sexual violence being perpetrated against women in small and big conferences around the world. And Japan does not recognize this violence. And I think because Japan has not recognized its wrongdoings, it has an impact on other parts of the world. It's like a case forming a precedent in court. Because Japan does not recognize and make an apologize or make compensation or be responsible for its past wrongdoings, if Japan did, it could form a precedent for the women of the contemporary times, or women who are suffering in the contemporary times. So do you engage in the state, the actions, as opposed to individuals' experiences? I'd like to know if there's research going on. And if you think about the Japanese comfort women or Baebonggi, the Korean comfort women, they are the victims who suffered the pain because of the violence of the state. And if you think about their nationalities, would that be the right approach? Because the perpetrator is the state. Does the nationality of the victim matter so greatly? And also you talked about monuments being erected around the world and that we are going in the right direction. I quite disagree because for the sex slaves of the World War II, people suffered because of state violence. And still today, because of state violence, the monuments are being torn down in places around the world. And also the statues are being relocated to private estates or to university campuses because of state violence, because the Japanese government is opposing against it. And also in the new incumbent Yoon Suk-yeol government, I think they are taking a more worsened position, because in the previous government, the Moon-jae-in government, in the girl statues, in the memorial days, the consulate offices would send the diplomats to those statues when there is a commemorative event going on. But the Yoon government is not having any of the diplomats participating in these overseas commemorative events because this is not a public matter. So I would like to know your views on how you understand this issue and how you research these topics as well. Well, thank you. So that's like a question. Who who would you like to have the question? Who would you suggest the response to your question? Or any researcher would be fine with me.
Yes, there were two questions from two members of the audience. The first audience's question will be answered by Ms. Kim Young-young, and regarding the statute, Ms. Kimura or Kinoko could give the answer. Yes, so the reply, please. Ms. Yang Mi-gang asked the question, and I actually did somewhat anticipate that maybe Ms. Yang Mi-gang would raise the question. I think it's not so much a question as the long thinkings based on your long experience in Jeongdaeyeop. And I think you pointed out some issues that I may have overlooked. So it is a very precious comment. Today I discussed listening. It's not just a simple listening. It's about who listens and when listens and where they listen. And as you said, the when and where is very important. It makes a big difference. That is something I also experienced. Even though we have a certain level of tension within this regime of nationalism, we cannot actually go over that. That was my starting point in my study paper and my analysis. So when we think of the 1990s, of that environment, back then, of course, the testimony of Kim Il-sung and the testimony of Bae Bong-ki were fundamentally different in their nature. Just as you said, Bae Bong-ki didn't necessarily speak toward the South Korea society. It was a purpose to gain a special resident status in Japan, Okinawa, Japan. So as I emphasized, I do not want to set a kind of a contending structure between the two. It is a rather pursuit toward a multi-directional memory in this project. So you also mentioned the first testimony in the Philippines and the witness or the victims in North Korea. In 1990s and in 2000s, they also were very active in testifying in the women's courts. And partially, it might not have been enough for the South Korean society, but for the feminist groups, so to say, of South Korea was an audience. It served as an audience for them. As a matter of fact, in a detailed manner, whether it's Grandma Hoon or Bae Bong-ki, they do not have a South Korean nationality because when they left Korea, there wasn't South Korea, there wasn't Korea or North Korea, there was only a colonial Korea, there was an imperialist Japan. And between those borders, they became stateless, whether they wanted it or not. So for these figures, I do agree with almost everything you say, but considering them as a South Korean nationality itself may be somewhat something that we should rethink from historical perspective, because we might then put them in the boundary of South Korea, which is also another entrapment of nation-state imagination. So I think this we could discuss on this topic later on. And for the following questions about the state violence of Japan, just as Ms. Yang Mi-gang mentioned, well, this did take place during the 1990s. The Japanese Emperor State's violence, which was also a major subject of studies. But these days, it is being somewhat overlooked in its interest because the trend of studies has developed in a different direction. And I do agree that there is an overlooking for that topic of study during the 1990s. And I think it would be meaningful to talk about that topic as well. And you brought up the need for that in your comment. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So I would like to know if Professor Kimura would like to respond. For those of us joining online, would you like to respond, Professor? I'd like to give you a very short response to Linda Mo's comments. I think you made a very important critique. Japan waged a war of aggression, and it incurred damage to places around the world, and it created actually huge damage. And if you look at the past of Japan, and Japan continues to inflict pain to others to this day. So what should Japan do? This is a very important point that we must continue to focus on. Since we have begun this Comfort Women movement, there has been internal discussions in Japan over this matter. So this has been at the focal point of our attention. So there's like a pretext. I think it is quite clear. I was not able to describe this in detail today in my presentation. My apologies for that. With regards to the movement, many people from the victim countries formed the Asian Solidarity Conference, and they include countries like Korea and others. And at this Solidarity Conference, we try to think of what is to be done. In the notice, we have made some suggestions and demands to the Japanese government. And using that as a background, in 2015, when we saw the conclusion of the Korea-Japan agreement, I think it was on the basis of such developments that the agreement has been concluded. And in Korea, there's been some protest against that agreement, trying to remove that agreement. And the researchers and the activists in Japan looked at the development. And it was quite difficult for these activists and researchers to take a different stance. The Korea-Japan agreement, we had thought about the engaging so that Korea-Japan movement agreement could be concluded in a more favorable manner, so to say. But I think these kind of movements have been there. It should be noted. The damage incurred by Japan in the form of state violence, I agree with you in that. I fully concur with you. Thank you very much. Yes, please go ahead.
I'm aware of the time, so I just want to briefly mention about the politics surrounding memorials. So I can't say for all the memorials, but I have been doing research on memorials in terms of why memories are erected in certain geographical locations, and I've been doing some kind of sort of ethnography around this issue. So obviously the politics surrounding memorials is not simple, and there's a complex politics surrounding how and why memories are erected in certain places. But and I can't say for all the memorials, but the memorials surrounding memorials which are erected outside Asia, for example, in the US or in Australia, it was really interesting to see, how people in the local residents, including some Asian community, trying to bring these statues, or sometimes that they have competitions to ask for local people to submit the design, and trying to memorize the victimization of these women who fell under the system of Japan's military sexual slavery, but at the same time trying to relate this victimization with other forms of maybe sexual and as well as gender violence. And this is, I think, is one of the really interesting the trend happening in global politics. And advocate how the victim's voices can also raise the issues of violence suffered by many other women, as well as possibly men as well, in contemporary society. So the erection of memorials, not just about the issue of the past, but trying to raise what's happening and in contemporary society, without trying to belittle the painful memory and painful experience suffered by those people, those women who fell victims of comfort women system.
Well, thank you very much. I think our time's almost up and we need to come to the close of today's meeting. With regards to the state violence of the Japan and the struggle against to protest against the state violence, it should continue. And we should attentively listen to the voices of the victims. We should think about better ways of doing that. In the afternoon session, we hope to continue our discussions on this very important topic, and we hope to come up with concrete action plans for this very important cause. I'd like to ask for a big round of applause to the speakers and discussants and also to the interpreters for their efforts. Thank you very much.